Good evening, everyone. Welcome to MAGFest. I hope you're all as excited to be here as we are. My name is Clay. This is my buddy Reese. We're a couple of college friends who bonded over our shared loves of video games of all kinds. Tonight we're going to talk to you a little bit about some FMV games we love, or that at least are important. And if you don't know what an FMV game is, you're definitely in the right place. If you're pretty knowledgeable, some of this may be old news, but we hope to leave you hopefully having learned something at the end of this hour. And on that note, our rehearsals have run pretty tight, so we're going to jump right into it. Reese, take it away.
All right. How's it going, folks? So starting off, let's talk about what an FMV game is, just to get everyone on the same page. So FMV stands for full motion video. This is kind of an archaic 80s buzzword that was used to describe games that were using realistic video, basically. At that time, most video games couldn't really do much beyond kind of a slideshow at most. They could, if you tried to render more than a couple of screenshots, it would take up most of your bandwidth. So full motion video was when games that could actually utilize video clips. Generally low resolution, low color depth at the time, but real video. So for the purposes of this panel, an FMV game is basically any game where most or all of the game is based on pre-rendered, non-in-engine, largely non-interactive video content. All right, so this is a slide just kind of giving an example of what we're talking about. So on the left, we've got just a screen from NBA Jam. You can see we've got a GIF, functionally, of a little bit of basketball going on there. And on the right, we have Sewer Shark, which is a Sega CD shooter. And then we've got, chunky but actual video. So we're breaking FMV games down into 3 different categories. We've got cutscene only, hybrid, and full FMV. For cutscene only, these are games that would leverage FMV content, be it live action or animated, mostly just for cutscenes, some like sizzle reels before the game started. Think like Tony Hawk. Ones that we think used it in an interesting way. Here I've got Metal Gear Solid 3, which used some live action footage of like the Bay of Pigs and Cold War newsreels to flesh out some of its points in cutscenes. And then Minnesota Fat's Pool Legend on the Saturn, which is just a pool game, but there's a whole narrative involving traveling across the country and betrayal and murder and all this stuff that's all done with live actors around the pool. So for the hybrid, that's games that will use some sort of video element prominently, but there's also normally rendered material as well. So I think a good example here is stuff like the PS1 to Final Fantasy games, where you have backgrounds that are completely pre-rendered and animate that you don't interact with them, you're just superimposed onto that content. And then finally there's full FMV, where more or less the entirety of the experience is video content. That's most of what we'll be talking about, and that's going to be your Dragon's Lair, Sewer Shark, stuff like that. All right, so what are some benefits of using FMV? So first of all, you have real actors, and if they are skilled actors, then you can get something that's, pretty solid out of that experience. I think that, at least early on, to appreciate FMV games, you really need to appreciate camp. A lot of early developers didn't have the chops or the background experience of actual film industry work, so it's a little cheesy. But as we progress, and as Clay gets into some later examples, the fidelity and the quality of the acting is going to go up dramatically. Some developers think that for certain types of stories, you can't tell them effectively unless you have real actors. So that's a benefit if you have that mindset. And at least early on, depending on your skill set and what tools you have available to you, it could have been easier to develop an FMV game than a traditional video game. You wouldn't have to know anything about pixel art or 3D rendering or rigging or anything like that. You just need to know how to film. All right, so what are some challenges? A lot, quite a few. So the main issue for most of these is that since this is pre-rendered video content, how you can actually engage with the game is going to be pretty limited. Let's say, for example, if you have a 3D action game like Bayonetta or Devil May Cry or something, the engine, the physics engine and stuff like that is going to handle a lot of your animations and how you're interacting with content. You don't have to explicitly plan out and code out every single use case. With the FMV, you do. Anytime something happens, you have to film, what happens if I did it right, what happens if I did it wrong. And to do that effectively without having a lot of jump cuts is going to be difficult. So you'll find that, at least early on, a lot of FMV games are going to be things that don't have to account for too many different use cases. So shoot 'em ups, where you're going to explode or not explode. Detective games where there's just dialogue and static cameras, or like choose your own adventure games where you're really just picking different dialogue, and then it goes to whatever you pick. Also, for a lot of the earlier systems, like the Sega CD and the TurboGrafx, as you can see from the screenshot, the fidelity of the video is low. It came from the desert, which came out on the TurboGrafx in 1991. Resolution was maybe 240p at best. I think sub 256 colors on screen at once. So it's pretty chunky.
I'm going to see if this will play for us. It doesn't seem to want to. So that's exciting. So, all right. Well, that's going to be a problem later, but I think you get the idea here. If it's not working later, we have an alternate plan here. Mm-hmm. But we'll move on for now.
Yeah. So what's fascinating about the development of FMV games is that whereas traditional video games kind of followed a linear path of progress technologically, where you go, NES, Super Nintendo, the N64, GameCube, it gets more realistic the further you go. FMV games kind of had an inverse bell curve, where they started off high fidelity, it became really chunky and gross, and then became high fidelity again. And that's because starting off, we were using laser discs. Clay brought a prop here, if anyone's not familiar with the laser disc. So a laser disc, for anyone who doesn't know, is, let's just call it a big DVD. It's the size of a record. It came out around the same time as VHS and Betamax, but it was higher fidelity than those materials, or those medium. And what's really important about laser discs versus VHS and Betamax for the context of video games is that it's not a strictly linear medium. So with the VHS, you start at the beginning, you go to the end, you have to rewind. But with the Laserdisc, much like a CD or a DVD, you can jump to different places in the data, which is great if you need to show different use cases, like we do in our first example.
If it'll load.
Second example.
This is so cool. I love this. This is definitely not my nightmare. All right.
You want to just slide that over?
I think I am going to do that. All right, check this out.
You're on it.
Please, I'm begging you. just work. Is one of those play? I don't think so. Well, check this out. I'm bringing it back. Hold on. All right. This is the video.
So this is a game called Astron Belt. This was produced by Sega in 1983. And this is what we would consider a hybrid FMV game. So we have an FMV background that's not being rendered in engine. It's just pre-existing footage. But you have kind of a traditionally rendered sprite of a ship on top of it. So this was released first in Japan And it was a big hit in the arcade because this came out 2 years after Galaga. So like a huge, increase in fidelity of the experience, even if not gameplay quality.
In a certain sense.
This came over to America, but did not have the same impact because it was beaten to the market by the next game we're going to talk about.
Yeah. Please hold. All right, no, come on. Come on. All right. This is great because, like I said, when we rehearsed this, it took us like 58 minutes, so we have a lot of buffer. Okay, all right.
Okay, that seems right. What have we got over there?
Nothing. We got nothing.
Okay.
All right, we're going to have to
Go to
go to what?
Go to the next slide.
Go to the next slide? Ooh,
There you go.
you're so smart.
That's why you pay me the big bucks. Yeah, so obviously we're going to talk about Dragon's Lair. Dragon's Lair is really the poster child of Laserdisc games. If anyone's not familiar with Dragon's Lair, this was a game produced in part by Don Bluth, who was an animator who worked on things like The Land Before Time, Anastasia, The Secret of Nim, so kind of a big name in the field of animation. So he and game designer Rick Dyer got together to make this game, which is basically a feature-length animated film that is interspersed with QuickTime events.
All right, so there was going to be a gameplay video here, but that's not working, so we're doing the same thing we just did. Everything's fine. I'm not upset about this at all.
Yeah, so imagine going to the arcade in the early mid-'80s, and you see Pong, you see Galaga, you see Pac-Man, and then you see this. This would blow your mind.
Yeah, so, and all the gameplay that's going on there is just you're pressing either in a direction on the joystick or pressing the sword button. It's extremely rudimentary and, frankly, usually or often unclear which one you're actually trying to do. And also, it was generally recommended to charge 50 cents per play for this at the time because of its, fantastic visuals. So this is a very expensive game to play.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. This is so awful.
We're making it work. It's okay.
All right. We're back.
All right. So this is kind of a breakdown of how Dragon's Lair works. In animation will play, you are expected to react to it, and if you don't press the exact right button at the exact right time, you immediately die and lose your 50 cents. So if you wanted to make any progress in this game, you'd have to bring a week's paycheck. In this case, this is the beginning of the game. You walk over a drawbridge, fall through a hole. There's a little moat monster. You have to press the sword button to attack him. If you don't, you die. You might think, oh, I press up, so I climb out of the hole. No, that's wrong. You die. No creative problem solving here. All right. All right. So Dragon's Lair was successful enough that it did kick off a bunch of similar games. So we got an actual sequel in Dragon's Lair 2. Bluth also worked on Time Ace, which is like a sci-fi version of Dragon's Lair. And then we got Space Ace, sorry. And then we got things like Road Blaster / Avenger and Time Gal and Cliffhanger, which follow the same sort of formula. I do think that Road Avenger works better than Dragon's Lair does because it gives you on-screen prompts to tell you what to do. And you're driving a car, so it makes more sense contextually than it does when you're just walking around a castle.
Yeah.
So.
Oh yeah, this is still you.
Yeah. So Laserdisc games didn't last too long in the arcade because they cost a lot. They weren't very interactive once you got over the spectacle of the graphics. And they were also difficult to maintain because you had a disk drive running in it and not instead of just a solid state board. So that kind of faded out, but it was replaced with our dear friends over here, the TurboGrafx CD and the Sega CD. These came out around 1990-91. The TurboGrafx CD was the first CD-based video game system. And their approach was more so, let's put out the normal games we put out, but either longer or add, better quality music. But Sega was like, oh, we're in a fight with Nintendo. We need to do something that they can't do to get more of a market share. Let's make a bunch of FMV games. So here's some examples of what the games they were putting out look like. Yeah, obviously you want to play Slam City versus Scottie Pippen instead of Chrono Trigger or Donkey Kong Country, because look at the fidelity of this video. So it was a gamble, which didn't really pay off financially or from a market share perspective, but there's still some interesting material out there if you're willing to put up with some eccentricities. So one of the primary companies that Sega worked with in this period was called Digital Pictures. They were headed by a guy named Tom Zito. Tom Zito thought that FMV games were the next big thing. He thought, once we roll these out, there's no way people are going to be satisfied with traditional, pixel art. Those are going to go the way of the dodo, and this will become the future. That didn't quite happen. But while they were working with Sega, they were pretty prolific. They put out quite a few games. First, Sewer Shark, which we briefly touched on before. But they also brought probably the most famous Sega CD FMV game,
Night Trap. Yeah, you can't do a panel about FMV games without talking about Night Trap. It is far and away the most notorious in a certain sense, but we'll more on that in a moment. Night Trap is a game that I think far outpaced in influence the expectations of anyone who worked on it. And yeah, it's a game. It kind of puts you in a special forces role. You're part of the Sega Control Attack Team, or SCAT. That acronym we all love. And your job is to stop this vampire family, pictured bottom left, the Martins, from feeding on a group of teens. Their daughter there has lured them from the shopping mall, as you find out in one scene, if you have a keen eye. You were originally called in response to an incident from a week or so prior when some other teens had gone missing at their estate, and they said, "Oh, no, they must have gotten lost after they left our house. We definitely didn't eat them." But now you've got this new group of teens, and you also have someone undercover, bottom right. That's Kelly. She's your woman on the inside. And you've also hacked all the cameras and traps around the house that they usually use to capture their victims and harvest their blood. And your job is basically to trap them, flip the script on them, and put them away for good. So the way it works is you've kind of got this interface up top. Obviously, this is the original Sega CD version, pretty low fidelity, low resolution. But it got the job done. But basically, like, all this stuff you see is happening in real time. You can only look at one camera at once, which is, of course, part of the challenge. But this is all happening at once, basically a little short film playing out. And your job is basically to keep an eye on everybody, protect the people you're supposed to protect, catch the bad guys, and make sure you don't accidentally catch any of the good guys. Contrary to maybe, I think, some of the popular perception of this game, I think it's actually great. It's really engaging to kind of, once you know what you're doing and you have a sense for sort of the prosody of the game, really engaging to catch the bad guys, feel like you're doing a good job. And, unlike something like Dragon's Lair, it's way less punishing. It does tolerate some failure. If you want to catch all the bad guys and have a perfect run, that's fine, but you can miss some and still beat the game, things like that. So not quite as ruthless or frustrating. And you know, you got to remember this was actually made back in like '87 because it was originally developed for a VHS-based system by Hasbro that was ultimately canceled. So I think this is a pretty clever idea for a format that basically had no rule book, no guidebook, nobody, you know, there wasn't a lot of precedent for this. So, you know, I think it has sort of achieved a meme status in the game space, but I think it's a lot of fun. And if you've kind of dismissed it, I encourage you to rethink that. Please.
Yeah, so Night Trap got re-released on modern systems. It's on Switch, PS4, right, by extension PS5, Vita.
Yeah.
The newer version does give you feeds of all the different cameras in the interface, whereas it was just static images of rooms initially. So that makes it a lot easier. There's also just an option to watch all of the footage as a movie if you want to see the whole story without having to jump back and forth to actually catch the dudes.
Yeah, so here's a couple examples of, you know, kind of the silly stuff that goes on in this game. If you're trying to catch every single bad guy in this game, you're going to be switching views constantly and mashing the trap button, and I promise it's great. It's good. The line also after this bed trap is absurd, but I won't spoil that for y'all. But this game, this is the last YouTube video. I'm so happy about that. That isn't rendering. I said this game had an outsized impact, and it definitely did, largely due to the scene that's not showing up, but I will show you momentarily. This scene was this was one of the highlighted games among a couple others that were discussed in 1993 congressional hearings on violence and adult content in video games. And you have very likely seen it before, but I'm going to show it to you anyway. Oh my goodness, I don't have it. Hold on. Hold on. No. It's totally fine. I'm not worried about it at all. Yeah. One moment.
While he's pulling that up, clearly based on this clip, Congress caring about the wrong things is not a new issue, unfortunately.
All right, I'm gonna be pretty upset momentarily. We've lost. Hold on. We have lost internet connection. Can I get you to sign us in again? Yeah. Thank you. Sorry about that. I appreciate it.
That should work. There you go.
Thank you. Yeah, this is the one. All right. Can I get you? There we go. All right.
So, despite Congress making such a huge deal about how gory and terrible this is, there's no blood at all. It's entire.
Yeah, so that's what happens if you're bad at the game. Okay, so glad we're done with video. Let's get back here. It's working. It's trying very hard. All right, we're back. Oh, and look, it showed up this time. Yeah. So this scene was taken way out of context. It was shown, for example, in these hearings, without the little coda there, where your boss is like, "Wow, you really screwed that one up, buddy," and fires you. It was sort of presented as if the object of the game was to kill this woman, and that Sega et al. Were trying to corrupt our youth by selling them games about murdering teenage girls. Obviously, that wasn't the case, but that's how these things go sometimes. So this, the result of this, wow, it's gonna play and everything. Okay. The result of this, was basically Senator Joe Lieberman here, as you can see, held up his Konami justifier at the spokespeople from Nintendo and Sega and was like, regulate yourselves or we'll regulate you. And obviously, being the capitalists that they were, they chose the former. They started the ESRB. And so, Night Trap inadvertently was played a significant role in the formation of video game ratings as we know them today. Some other games naturally talked about in those hearings were Mortal Kombat, and then another one called Lethal Enforcers, which was a home port of an arcade game that featured the plastic gun that Mr. Lieberman is holding there. Anyway, they were obviously right, and thanks to these ratings, nothing violent has ever happened again. I mean, in all seriousness, so obviously I think this is a way that Night Trap's impact was far outsized from the kind of silly and campy but genuinely fun game that it is. I do think it's good on the merits, and it should not be thought of only as a game that did this. Like Reese said, it's got a port to basically all modern platforms. That's super cleaned up, high definition video, everything, improved interface, a lot of behind the scenes stuff, interviews, etc. I really don't think there's a better time to play it than now. So really, if you take nothing else away from this panel, please play Night Trap. So digital pictures continued to be quite prolific into the mid-90s. They went on to do a number of other cool projects. They iterated on the Night Trap idea with a game called Double Switch, which sort of took place in this haunted hotel. They tried some light gun stuff with games like Corpse Killer and Ground Zero Texas. They made a basketball game with Scottie Pippen that we showed you earlier. They even made a couple make-your-own music video games with artists like NXS and Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch. If that's more your speed. There was really nothing they wouldn't touch, and I do admire that about them. They threw a lot of stuff at the wall. A lot of it didn't work, but they were out there doing stuff. Man in the Arena or whatever.
Marky Mark worked, though. Obviously. That was the highlight.
Yeah, bestseller. Tom Zito, the founder we mentioned earlier, he was, like we said, real true believer in the format. In interviews, he insisted that FMV was the future of video games. He was like, computer graphics will never catch up and be able to convey human emotion like, live action video will. And, he sort of envisioned this future with like an interactive set-top cable box. This was the future of home interactive entertainment. You would, watch your stories and, choose your own adventure or whatever. Unfortunately, his company went defunct like a year after he said that, so the game-playing public did not seem to believe in his vision, and I suppose we'll never know if he was right. Nevertheless, the 90s wore on, and we started to see wider adoption of CD-ROMs on PCs, and with their significantly increased storage capacity compared to floppy disks, this brought the power of FMV to yet another home platform, the PC. And a game I want to talk about in that space is Phantasmagoria. I think this game is a really just fascinating bit of effort, is how I'll put it. It was conceived of and written by Roberta Williams of King's Quest fame. Like that game, it is also a point-and-click adventure. The game is about this couple pictured here that just has bought a haunted house and moved into it, unbeknownst to them, of course. Shortly after moving in, Don, the husband there on the left, starts kind of behaving erratically, a little violently. You know, he has clearly changed from the loving husband he once was. And the protagonist, Adrian, on the right, has to survive the horrors of the house, solve the mystery, try to save her husband, etc. You know, we were just talking about a very controversial game in Night Trap. This one was also somewhat as well, but, you know, I guess Congress had washed their hands of it by that point, so they didn't do another round of hearings. But yeah, it featured a lot of gory and explicit cutscenes, heads getting torn open, and yeah, it's a lot going on here. But I figured y'all were all probably plenty traumatized by the Night Trap clip, so I decided not to include those here. But here's a nice, you know, screenshot of the lovely family having a picnic with their cat to hopefully calm everyone's nerves. Yeah, what sets Phantasmagoria apart, I think, in this space is that it takes a really visually striking approach of pre-rendering all of its environments in 3D while overlaying blue screen performances by all of its characters to convey the action. Every movement of the protagonist around the environment had to be painstakingly shot and performed and then digitized into the game, which just seems exhausting. Half the reason I wanted to tip my cap to this game is that I just think it would have taken an extraordinary amount of work. Digitized sprites like this, of course, had been done before in games like Mortal Kombat, but in cases like that was usually, you know, 5 or 6 frame tight animations. Nothing nearly as ambitious as this. The movement here is truly full motion. And there were a couple other games like Wing Commander 3 and Under a Killing Moon that also beat it to the punch. But again, in those games, typically the performances were stationary, so they wouldn't have to worry about, you know, okay, is it going to look right when this actor is moving around the scene? They didn't want to have to worry about that kind of stuff. And then also the protagonist moved around with a first-person view, so they wouldn't have to worry about animating that either. Phantasmagoria cut no corners. And so, yeah, got a GIF here, not a video, that hopefully will load and show you a little bit what I'm talking about. You can see Adrian here. This is sort of opening scene of the game, walking around the house. You know, you can see how she's always appropriately scaled. You know, I think like something like this, her just walking over to this door, opening it, closing it behind her, walking outside, lighting her, you know, appropriate for the scene, all that sort of stuff would have taken an extraordinary amount of effort. I find it really impressive. You know, obviously today, you know, there's artifacting. It's not the highest quality. This obviously looks very 1995, but I just love it, and I think it's one of the more interesting ways I've seen, you know, live acting transposed into a video game in a way that, in certain ways, maybe isn't as limiting as something like Night Trap, which is, you know, fully live action footage. But as it happens, Phantasmagoria isn't even actually the first haunted house game on PC to use superimposed live acting. That honor belongs to the 7th guest, which is, I'm gonna see if this works. I have my doubts, but yeah, Phantasmagoria could kind of be seen as an iteration on the concepts brought forth by the 7th guest. The 7th guest was one of the very first PC CD-ROM games ever released, and in this game you proceed through another 3D pre-rendered mansion, solving puzzles, you know, a little bit like Myst or something like that, and occasionally see visions of the past. These visions are of the eponymous guests who were invited there some decades ago for what they thought was a party. It turned out they were then thrust into a competition to see who could kind of solve the mystery of this, you know, reclusive, wealthy guy's house and receive his grand prize. He invited them all because he knew they had specific vices or they had debts or things like that. So there's, you know, lots of backstabbing, both figurative and literal. It's a compelling little game. Obviously, you know, it's kind of silly. The acting is of the time and of the budget, but it's a lot of fun. And unlike some of the other games we've talked about, it was critically well received at the time. It was a killer app. It helped drive the adoption of the CD-ROM drive in the PC space. So, kind of a big deal. Hopefully, pressing play will do what one would think it might. Oh. So, yeah, as you can see, they were kind of setting up the next puzzle. To the best of my knowledge, is not impossible. But yeah, like Phantasmagoria, you can kind of see that the overlaid performances have some artifacting, but the developers ultimately felt that the chroma key artifacts weren't actually that big of a deal. They actually thought that they kind of made the people look more ghostly. So they didn't like obsess over getting that just right, and I think that's kind of a fun way of making the sort of technological limitations of the time work for you. So I really like that. Anyway, if you, like me, have had your mind blown by the sheer realism of the past couple of games I've shown you, and think that all games should aspire to an aesthetic like this, then as a quick sidebar, I got great news. The seventh guest was... Shut up. The seventh guest was recently remade in VR. It was thanks to volumetric video recording. All those old cutscenes have been reshot with new actors, and the performances are rendered in real time, right before your eyes. You can walk around and watch the performances from any angle, and I think that's really cool and fun. I think it's a great excuse to bring this game back. Something we kind of talked about is that emergent technology kind of has caused these booms in FMV games. First we had Laserdiscs, so that was an opportunity to bring video to arcade. Then we had CD-based consoles. It was an opportunity to bring video to consoles. We had PC CD-ROM, etc. Here, I think there's a confluence of things happening that make this remake make sense. Obviously, now we can render the mansion in 3D in real time. We've been able to do that for a while, but nevertheless. And then you have, a new and kind of exciting way to do live action in a video game. And, they rebuilt a lot of the puzzles from the ground up for VR. So they're playing with a lot of different tech, and it makes sense to bring back in this sense. And also does something that I think a lot of remakes don't accomplish, which is the result is actually that there are now just two really cool and interesting games. This doesn't obviate the original. If anything, it makes it more compelling for people like me who came to this first. Yeah, so I just tip my cap to that because I think that's hard to do, and cool. Yeah, really quickly, this is what a volumetric video setup looks like. You're shot from all these different angles, you're lit from all these different angles, and then that can be, thrown into a 3D real-time environment. To the best of my knowledge, no other games have used this tech yet. I could totally be wrong, but in any case, I think it's really cool. Unfortunately, it's time to move on from the 90s, and yeah, once we start to get into the late 90s, we start to see comparatively few FMV games, especially with live actors, and especially of the kind of type that Digital Pictures was making, where it was really almost fully FMV driven. Still a lot of stuff with FMV cutscenes, like the games presented here. That was still pretty popular and common. A lot of times developers would use it to, do scenes of higher 3D fidelity than they could in engine. There's a rather famous scene in Final Fantasy VII that comes to mind. But yeah, that was kind of more what we saw. We didn't see the kind of stuff that Tom Zito was obsessed with. And so for a while, it kind of seemed like maybe this design philosophy was going away. But I'm pleased to report it very much has not. In the mid to late 2010s, FMV games have really started to make a little bit of a comeback. Some of them have reviewed pretty well and brought some prestige to, I think, a genre or format or whatever you want to call it that maybe has been thought of as limited or gimmicky or not that good. That was never true, but some people thought that. And yeah, there's been a real bevy of stuff published in the past decade or so. There have been remakes and remasters of some of the classics, like we mentioned earlier. Yeah, arguably never been a better time to be into these sort of games. So I'm gonna try to quickly run through some of the highlights of the past 10 years or so, just to give you all an idea of kind of the breadth of what's been coming out the past while. Yeah, one of the important games from the past decade or so is Her Story. That came out in 2015. It was developed independently by Sam Barlow. It's basically kind of a detective game. You're trying to solve an old case from the 90s. Basically just drops you at an old police computer, and you have to sift through a bunch of footage of police interviews with a lone British woman. Your job is to figure out what happened with her case. And Barlow said that he chose to implement this game as FMV because he thought it was easier to convey kind of the emotion and the acting directly through video rather than try to accomplish the same with a 3D model, kind of echoing some of what Zito said all those years ago. And I think he was kind of vindicated. This was pretty critically well received. So yeah, the way it works is a little bit of a contrivance, but I'll allow it because it's interesting. This is what the interface looks like, very 90s Windows kind of environment. The only way you can query the database is by searching with text, entering like you would on Google or whatever. And the search engine will match what you enter against the transcripts of these interviews, yielding any clips that match your search terms. This can lead to a really fun kind of chain reaction where maybe in one video you learn somebody's name, so you look that up, and then in another video you find a place of interest or an important date, something like that, and you can really go down a lot of rabbit holes. And the interesting thing about this is obviously there is underneath this a chronological linear narrative, but the game basically guarantees that you will not experience it linearly, and furthermore that basically everyone who plays it will experience it in a different order. And I think that's a lot of fun. Again, does it make a lot of sense that this computer wouldn't just let you open the files that exist on it? No, but whatever. It's cool and fun, and yeah, I think it's really interesting. And just briefly, here's kind of a still from the game. As you can see, it's shot in 4:3, as was the style of the time. And Barlow also ran it through a VCR to really try to achieve the look of the time. He iterated on the idea in 2019 with a game called Telling Lies, which used almost the exact same kind of system, but I think more interestingly in 2022 with Immortality. In this game, the idea is very similar. Once again, you're kind of solving a mystery. In this case, the question is, what happened to Marissa Marcel? Marissa Marcel is a fictional actress who shot 3 films. They were shot in their entirety, but none of them were ever released. On top of that, she was basically a recluse the entire time, didn't make many public appearances, so this kind of led to an in-universe, kind of internet fandom that was like, well, what happened? What's going on with these? Why did these never come out? And finally, someone has dumped all of the footage from all of the movies in your lap, and you got access to everything, except immediately you don't actually. There's a bug on the little machine you're using, and you actually only have access to 1 clip. This is, again, another contrivance, but you got to do what you got to do. And instead of like querying with text and like searching for something that might exist in the subtitles or whatever, this time you are looking around for objects or people or things of interest within the scene. So the way it works is, for example, you may be watching a clip from the first movie, and it zooms in on a key. You can click on that, and it'll create a match cut and jump to a scene from another one of the clips of someone else holding keys. You do that again, it'll jump to another scene where a character is receiving a key card at a hotel. And I think this is really cool. It has a similar effect to Her Story, where you can really, you can get 5 or 6 clips deep before you actually remember to watch any of them in full. I think that's a lot of fun. In an interview, Barlow said he was kind of going for the feeling of exploratory reward from Breath of the Wild, which he said admittedly was a high bar. But I think, like, to a certain extent, with the inherently non-interactive medium he's working with, he kind of accomplished what he was shooting for. But his idea was that anything you can see in a scene should be rewarding in some way. You should be able to follow. You should be able to say, "I want to go see where that leads me," and it should reward you in some way. You may not solve the mystery immediately because you're a genius, but it will. It'll at least yield more content from these 3 entire films he made that were kind of period pieces from the 60s, 70s, and 90s. Or shot as if they were made then. Yeah, a lot of really interesting work went into this, and I think this is a really clever way to directly interact with video that echoes some of the cleverness of like Night Trap and things like that. This is really a fully original idea that hasn't been done before. But I by no means want to lay the revival of FMV entirely at Barlow's feet. Plenty of other people have been involved. In 2015, the same year as Her Story came out, Tim Fallon made a detective game called Contradiction. Sort of along the lines of the name, the idea here is that you are solving mystery by interviewing witnesses and spotting differences in their testimony and determining the truth by drilling in on that. Something I think that's interesting about this is you may have noticed the past 3 games I've mentioned have been about solving a mystery of some sort, and there was we briefly showed a Sherlock Holmes game earlier. The detective game is very popular in this space, I think, because I think it's conducive to it. The action is largely dialogue driven. That can all be done with live actors. If you're investigating a scene maybe for evidence or whatever, that can also be done with still images of real life places or whatever the case may be, or brief clips interacting with those scenes. You can kind of imagine if you played the Ace Attorney games, you have your investigation days. Those are all generally just still scenery, and you tap on the screen where you think you see something of note. By the same token, the courtroom scenes could be live action if you wanted. They did make an Ace Attorney movie, after all. So yeah, I think really anything that doesn't rely on kind of a physics engine and is much more dialogue driven like this is kind of something that could work in this space, and it's just a matter of somebody deciding that they think is the best path for it.
Yeah. Another data point on that is that Square Enix actually put out an FMV game a couple years ago called The Centennial Case. Once again, kind of a detective deal. But yeah, so big, large-scale third-party developers are starting to put out FMV games, whereas previously that would be completely out of the scope of something they'd be interested in.
Yep. On a similar note, another game from 2019 was the interactive thriller Erica. This was published by Sony for the PS4 and later ported, I believe, to mobile platforms. This was developed by Flavorworks, and Sony brought it to PlayStation, I think, to sort of kind of broaden the audiences they were appealing to. This is, mostly a branching narrative game. It's almost entirely live action, and your only real interaction with the game at all is to make decisions, and then stuff happens as a consequence. This originally used Sony's PlayLink, I think it was called, for PS4. Pretty short-lived companion app. Again, trying to kind of expand, into that maybe more casual, to use a term I don't like, space. I don't mean that in a demeaning way. Just broaden their audience and see if this interested people. Ultimately, I don't think it did that well for them, but Telltale Games, which apparently still exists, acquired Flavorworks, who made this game, which I think is pretty interesting. Telltale, of course, made things like The Wolf Among Us, Walking Dead, those sort of branching narrative games with traditional graphics. I'm interested to see if they are maybe, maybe their next project will be live action, and that's why they made this acquisition. All speculation, but we'll see. Another interesting game from the past few years is not for broadcast. This is a propaganda and censorship simulator, basically. This is a little more in the Night Trap vein, where you are, watching footage. Watching footage, and you have to react and, enact the censorship rules of the state you live in. This one is of note because it has the record for most FMV recorded for a game at 43 hours. Very ambitious, very interesting. I think it also has sort of like a papers, please approach where you can choose to do the things you're supposed to do or not and experience the consequences thereof. Interesting game. Obviously, there's some political commentary at play, so your mileage may vary with that, of course. But this is an ambitious project. Another one I really love is a game called Squad 51 versus the Flying Saucers. I really wanted to give this game its flowers during this panel. This is a game developed by LumiArts, a small Brazilian studio. They produced a shmup of all things with FMV cutscenes, a sort of an homage to 50s sci-fi and kaiju films and things like that. We mentioned earlier we weren't going to talk a lot about games that only really use FMV for cutscenes, but I think this is an exception because the cutscenes and the gameplay itself really kind of complement each other to create a sort of cohesive art direction. The director of the game, Marcio Rosa, talked about how he really obsessed over, getting the shaders just right in the game and, making sure to animate enemies at certain frame rates that would have been appropriate for the movies at the time. I think it's really brilliant. There's a lot of great, set pieces, a lot of great enemies that really look like they're ripped right out of the movies from those times. Can't recommend this highly enough. I would also say it's a good kind of starter game, I would say, for both FMV games and for shmups. Shoot 'em ups are generally considered rather unforgiving genre, deservedly so. But I think this is a really beginner-friendly one. It's not too frustrating. I'm by no means an expert at these, and I knocked it out in a couple hours. And then you can dip your toes in the world of live-action cutscenes at the same time. Yeah, I think this game's brilliant, and hope y'all check it out. But I also can't finish here without mentioning Wales Interactive. If you have played an interactive film in the past 10 years or so, there's a very significant chance it was made by them. They have made over a dozen since 2016. I believe their first was The Bunker, which is a horror film, but they have touched rom-com, thriller, heist, noir, you name it. They've really done a little bit of everything. They haven't been afraid to try things. Their co-founder, David Banner, attributes their success largely to working with their partners in the burgeoning film industry in Wales. They kind of trust them to do a quality job, to do their job. They, as a game development studio, think that they have a solid branching narrative engine and that they can, stitch everything together well and come up with good concepts, and then they pitch those to the filmmakers and let them do their jobs. As Reese mentioned earlier, a lot of times back in the day, these were amateurs, these were really game developers wearing a director's hat, and the results were kind of what you would expect based on that. I think they put out a lot of interesting stuff. Some better than others, but nevertheless, they seem to have found a path to, profitability with these, and I'm glad to see it. I think it's heartening. So you may be wondering, why is this happening now? Why did these largely go away for the better part of 15, 20 years and then kind of start creeping back into the cultural consciousness? I think once again it's basically a matter of technology. Since kind of the last console generation, digital distribution has become fully mature. Obviously been that way in the PC space longer. Mobile games or mobile phones are also obviously a lot more powerful and can store a lot more data. So, a lot of these interactive films are perfectly suited to that platform as well. And just as importantly, since then, excuse me. And because of digital distribution, it's a much lower risk. If you were working on something like this 15 or 20 years ago for, PS2 or GameCube or something, it's kind of a hard sell to make a 2-hour interactive film and try to charge somebody $50 for that on a disc at retail. Making a $10 digital download, people are a lot more likely to bite on something like that. But also, since around that time, we've been able to reliably assume that the machines people are playing games on are outputting at least an HD standard. So you have a kind of minimum expectation of fidelity that wasn't guaranteed prior to that. And so again, something else David Banner of Wales Interactive said is, filmmakers back before that was the case weren't as interested in touching this kind of thing because they knew they weren't working with the best, and they weren't working with truly film quality options. So now it's a much easier sell to them to be like, hey, work with us on this interactive media. And again, we're at this stage where companies like Sony are kind of trying to prop up these tentpole franchises that are multimedia. They have games, shows, movies, etc. Maybe just jump right to making the movie. I don't know. I don't know if that's necessarily where anyone's head is at, but I could certainly see that approach being taken in the future. And on that note, what's next? I really don't know. One thing I will say is I think unlike previous periods of FMV games where we've kind of had these booms and busts, fads as per the title of the panel, I think we're kind of moving into more of a holding pattern here because of the reduced financial risk of making them, like I just talked about. The fact that some of these recent games have done well critically and financially doesn't hurt either, since that has sort of done something to elevate the prestige of the format that has at times been perceived as gimmicky. I hope and think we'll continue to see innovative ways to get over the inherent interactivity challenge presented by pre-shot footage and pre-recorded video. And I've been delighted. I hope is evident by some of the examples I just gave, by the ways we've seen that just in the last few years. People are thinking about new ways you can do that, even as difficult of a challenge as that is. People aren't out of ideas, and I don't think they're going to be anytime soon. And then, kind of a lazy thing to throw out here, but acknowledging emerging technologies again. I think the VR space is certainly not tapped out either. There are interesting ways that that FMV could be leveraged in that format. I don't know what they are, but hopefully people smarter than me do. And then, the only thing I know it's not going to be is generative AI slop. The people that are going to make these games are going to be people, and I think that's going to be the case in art for years to come. That's all I got. I think we have 40 seconds for questions or comments. I saw your hand first.
What about Harvester? What are your thoughts on Harvester?
Do you have thoughts on Harvester?
I've watched gameplay of Harvester. I've not played it myself. It feels like a little proto-incel-y. Not something that I feel a need to go back to, but it's fascinating. There's some interesting artistic choices.
You had something? Oh, great.
Yeah.
Yeah, the question was, do I think there's an appetite for something like Phantasmagoria or Harvester, something kind of ultra-violent and bloody and gory and things like that, yeah, I think the answer is obviously yes. There's always going to be a market for that, and yeah, I mean, I'd love to see that.
I think it depends on context, because we're definitely in a different cultural space than we were in the mid '90s. So I think some of that stuff wouldn't fly now the way it did back then. But there's still a market for Mortal Kombat. There's still Saw and stuff like that. And so, yeah, I think it can be done. It would just require a little more finesse.
You guys remember when Netflix tried to make interactive movies?
Yes, I specifically didn't include that in this panel. Well, partially for time and partially because they've delisted a lot of it, and I think that sucks.
Yeah, how do we play those now?
Yeah, you can't. That's the long and short of it. But yes, I do remember that. I think a very small amount of them are still available, but yeah, they've largely abandoned it and delisted a lot of it. That's a real bummer.
Yeah.
Yes.
What was the laser disc that you have?
That was the masterpiece of cinema, Sudden Death, starring Jean-Claude Van Damme.
If you haven't seen it, it's Die Hard but hockey. Yeah, it takes place during the Stanley Cup Finals between the Penguins and the Blackhawks. It's awesome.
He gets in a fight with the Penguins mascot.
Yeah.
Great piece of cinema. We're being told to wrap it up, so I think that's all. We're certainly happy to talk to some folks outside if anybody else wants to chat.